The Vanishing in the Thin Air, the first man hijacked the commercial airline in the USA. The Disappearance of D. B. Cooper, 1971. Please subscribe my channel. It was the day before Thanksgiving on November 24, 1971, when a well-dressed man in his mid-40s walked up to the Northwest Orient Airlines counter in Portland, Oregon, just before 2 p.m. He was wearing a dark raincoat, dark suit with a skinny black J.C. Penney tie, and a white shirt, and he was carrying an attaché case. He wanted to buy a one-way coach class ticket to Seattle, Washington. He handed the agent a $20 bill and said that his name was Dan Cooper. Cooper boarded Flight 305 with 35 other passengers and sat in seat 18C. He had that last row of the airplane to himself. There were 3 flight attendants, 2 pilots, and a flight engineer for the 25-minute trip aboard the Boeing 72-100. He ordered a bourbon and soda and lit up Raleigh filter-tip cigarettes. He was a quiet man. He seemed rather nice, flight attendant Tina Mucklow later said. He was never cruel or nasty. He was thoughtful and calm. At about 3:22 p.m., soon after takeoff, Cooper donned a pair of wraparound sunglasses and handed a flight attendant a note. Thinking that he was hitting on her for a date, Mucklow placed the note in her pocket. He motioned for her to read it. "Miss, I have a bomb," it said. She followed his order to take a seat beside him. To demonstrate that he was serious, he opened his briefcase and showed Mucklow 2 red cylinders and a tangle of wires. The flight attendant wrote down Cooper's instructions to give the pilot. The hijacker would blow up the Boeing 727 unless he received $200,000 in $20 bills placed in a laundry sack and 4 parachutes when the plane landed in Seattle. Mucklow brought the note to the pilot, Captain William W. Scott and First Officer William Radizak. It was the first time that a plane was being hijacked strictly for money. Previous hijackers had done it for political reasons. Captain Scott radioed the hijackers' demands to Seattle-Tacoma Airport's air traffic control tower before they reached their destination that day. The amount being requested was so large that airline workers had to go to several banks to collect the money. 2 types of parachutes were found at McChord Air Force Base in Tacoma and rushed to Seattle. When Cooper found out that he was being given military models, he demanded skydiving sport models instead. Military models open automatically after about 200 feet, whereas with sport chutes divers can free fall as long as they want before pulling the ripcord. Seattle police tried to find a skydiving school that was open just before the Thanksgiving holiday. They tracked down Earl Casey, who was enjoying a day off. He packed the 4 parachutes and handed them to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Agents thought the hijacker might be requesting extra parachutes because he planned to have some of the crew jump with him. At 4:50 p.m. ground control told the pilots, FBI and police have advised no action to be taken. We are awaiting his concurrence that you should land. But it was taking time to gather the money and parachutes. While everything was being prepared to meet Cooper's demands, the plane circled over the Seattle airport. Passengers were unaware of the hijacking. They were told that the plane was having mechanical trouble and it was trying to burn up fuel before landing. He was quite relaxed, sitting in the back seat on the starboard, right side. Passenger Robert B. Gregory later told a reporter. Another passenger, William Mitchell of Redmond, Washington, was sitting across the aisle from Cooper and had no idea what he was up to. The plane landed just before 6 p.m., but passengers were kept on the plane until the money and parachutes were ready. Impress on this man that we are not trying to stall, the tower radioed. The money is on its way. It was picked up at more than one bank. Northwest was assembling enough money to pay the ransom, the biggest ever paid in a U.S. hijacking at the time. Captain Scott was careful not to alarm the hijacker. "We'll ask you to stay there until we can coordinate with our friend in the back, the hijacker," he told the crews on the ground when the plane landed in Seattle. An official of the Federal Aviation Administration boarded the plane at one point and tried to talk the hijacker into surrendering. "Let's get this show on the road," Cooper had replied. Once the ransom money, all 21 pounds of it, and parachutes were placed aboard the plane, Cooper let the other passengers leave. negotiations continued about the 3 flight attendants on board. At 6:50, Scott told Northwest Control that 2 of the flight attendants had been allowed to leave. One flight attendant remained with Cooper. "He's getting awfully antsy. He wants the stewardess sitting back there with him on the takeoff." Cooper wanted Scott and Radizak to take the plane to Mexico. The crew explained that it was out of the plane's maximum range. He agreed to a refueling stop in Reno and wanted the plane to fly low and slow. He ordered the 2 pilots to fly at an altitude of under 10,000 feet, with the wing flaps at 15 degrees, the landing gear down, and the rear stairway door unlocked. This would slow the plane down enough to make jumping easier. At this rate it would not be able to fly faster than about 200 miles per hour. The plane, which the airline had purchased in 1965, was easy to maneuver. It had the ability to take off at low speeds and land at small airports. It was also the only commercial jet to be equipped with stairs in the rear of the plane and from which it was safe to parachute because the rear exit is behind and under the engines. After the plane left Seattle, Cooper sent the flight attendant to the cockpit, where she was to stay with the rest of the crew. As Mucklow glanced back on her way to the cockpit, she thought that she saw Cooper using a cord to tie something, probably the 21-pound bag of money, around his waist. He remained in the cabin by himself and communicated with Captain Scott over the intercom. At 7:42 p.m., 5 minutes after the plane had left Seattle, a red light came on in the cockpit indicating that the rear stairway door had been opened. The crew heard nothing from the hijacker for about 20 minutes. At 8:10 p.m. the plane crossed the Lewis River in southwestern Washington state, near the village of Ariel, southwest of Woodland. The plane was flying at 7,000 feet and about 200 miles an hour. Scott thought that the hijacker was having trouble with the ramp. "Anything we can do for you?" he asked over the plane's intercom. There was no answer. Another light flashed showing that the rear stairs were fully extended. A few seconds later, Cooper replied no, in response to Scott's question. It was the last that anyone heard from him. Cooper strapped on one parachute to his chest and the other to his back. Then he climbed down the rear stairs of the airplane. A cover of cloud hovering at 5,000 feet obscured the rugged wooded terrain below. When the plane landed in Reno, Nevada, the rear ramp was down. There was no sign of Cooper, the 21-pound sack of money, 2 parachutes, and the explosive device. The hijacker had leapt from the plane somewhere over southwestern Washington and into a thunderstorm with 200-mile-per-hour winds, freezing rain, and a temperature of -7 degrees Fahrenheit. He was wearing little more than a business suit and street shoes. As FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach pointed out to reporters, he didn't ask for a helmet, gloves, flight jacket, jumpsuit, or boots. It was 7 below zero outside. It was dark, and the plane was going 196 miles per hour. And he was wearing slip-on loafers. 2 Air Force jet fighters and a C-130 cargo plane had trailed the 727 from Seattle, but they didn't see anyone parachute from the plane. The military planes could not fly sufficiently slowly or low enough to keep the 727 in view. An Air Force spokesman told a reporter that Cooper would not have been seen under the cover of darkness if he went into freefall for 1,000 feet before opening his chute. Himmelsbach headed the Cooper investigation until he retired on March 1, 1980. He had been a P-40 fighter pilot in World War II, and he tried to intercept the airliner in a helicopter flown by an Army pilot. But we couldn't follow them. The visibility was terrible and we were too slow. In the ensuing media coverage, a reporter mistakenly identified the hijacker as D.B. Cooper, a moniker that stuck. Dan Cooper, the name that the man gave the Northwest Orient Airlines agent at the ticket counter, was an alias. The FBI interviewed a Portland man with that name the day after the hijacking and cleared him of any involvement. 2 flight attendants described the unknown hijacker as being 5 feet, 10 inches to 6 feet tall, 170 to 180 pounds, in his mid-40s, with brown eyes and short dark hair. He had an olive, Latin appearance, a wide forehead, and a receding hair. He had a low voice with no discernible accent and chain-smoked Raleigh filter-tip cigarettes. The FBI learned of the hijacking while the flight was airborne and immediately launched an investigation that is still open nearly 40 years later. They called it NORJAC, for Northwest Hijacking. After the plane had landed minus Cooper, agents boarded the aircraft and scoured it for evidence. Cooper left nothing behind but his skinny black tie, a tie tack, 8 of his cigarette butts, and the 2 parachutes. He had reclaimed the note that he had given Mucklow, leaving no fingerprints as evidence. Investigators believe they were looking for an experienced skydiver or paratrooper. Northwest offered a $25,000 reward for recovery of the ransom. Searchers did not know precisely where Cooper had landed, but the FBI had an idea of the most likely spot. It concentrated on a wilderness area 25 miles northeast of Portland, Oregon, starting around Amboy, Washington, just south of Lake Merwin. 30 deputies from Clark and Cowlitz counties and half a dozen FBI agents searched the woods and farmland near Woodland, Washington. "We're either looking for a parachute or a hole in the ground," Under Sheriff Tom McDowell of Clark County said at the time. Soldiers from Fort Lewis also participated. Planes, helicopters, jeeps, and dogs were used in the search. The men combed a densely wooded region northeast of Woodland. It was rugged terrain and had freshly fallen snow that made the area nearly impassable. Low clouds and fog hampered the efforts of FBI agents, sheriff's deputies, and the helicopter and ground crews. The Army withdrew its helicopters because of poor visibility, but lumber company Weyerhaeuser and the Bonneville Power Administration made intermittent passes over the area. The search was disbanded a week later. Having found no traces of Cooper or the money, searchers believe that he died when he jumped from the plane. In late March 1972, they resumed the search with 300 soldiers from Fort Lewis. They hoped the thawing ground would reveal a body, a parachute, or cash. After having found no trace of Cooper or his loot 18 days later, the search was called off. He had committed the first successful hijacking of an American airliner. Without mandatory security screening to examine carry-on bags, there were an alarming 147 hijackings between 1967 and 1972. On December 8, 1971, U.S. Attorney General John N. Mitchell released the serial numbers of the $20 bills that comprised Cooper's ransom. Some newspapers published the list, hoping that the money, and the audacious hijacker, would turn up. But no bills were recovered. With few other clues available, the FBI drew up a profile of the hijacker. Cooper knew how to skydive in difficult conditions, which led agents to believe that he had been in the Army or was a paratrooper. He was also sufficiently familiar with planes to give the pilots precise instructions about the altitude at which to fly and the angle of the wing flaps he needed to make his jump. In the first year following the hijacking, a letter addressed to the New York Times was sent from the 902 area code that includes San Diego and part of Orange County. It claimed to be from Cooper's brother, and said that the hijacker had died September 12, 1972, after an illness. The FBI searched death records for someone whose background included a death after a lengthy illness, but they turned up no leads. Despite the setbacks, the FBI doggedly pursued their investigation. In 1979, a hunter in Washington state found a heavy plastic placard that was an emergency warning notice of the type posted next to the rear exit of 727s. The notice, which was found in a wooded area, had been missing from Cooper's 727 after he jumped. There isn't any way that it could have come off a plane without the door being opened. Cowlitz County Sheriff Les Nelson said at the time. It's inconceivable, it's 1 in a million, that any other plane could have lost it in the area in which D.B. Cooper jumped. The placard was found 6 flying minutes from where he was believed to have jumped. On February 10, 1980, Harold Dwayne Ingram and his 8-year-old son, Brian, were on a family picnic on the north bank of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. Ingram, an aircraft assembly plant painter, had an armload of wood and was about to build a fire. His son pushed away some sand. 3 bundles of money came into view. Brian had found a package of $5,880 in decomposing $20 bills, damaged by prolonged exposure to water. Almost all of the money had crumbled around the edges and some had shrunk to about the size of a business card. The bills were found in 12 bundles, each of which was bound with a rubber band. The serial numbers matched 294 of the bills that Cooper had been given. It was the only Cooper money ever to be recovered, and it was believed to have washed down from one of the Columbia River's tributaries. The FBI cordoned off the area to search for more money and possibly the hijackers' remains. Our intent is to dig up this beach and see if we can find any more bundles of money, or a suitcase maybe that he carried it in, said a law enforcement official during the manhunt. FBI agents combed the beach but were unable to find the other 9,706 bills. In 1986, Ingram and the insurance company for Northwest Orient each received $2,760 of the money that Ingram found. The FBI kept 14 of the $20 bills in case Cooper is ever found and prosecuted. In March 1995, Florida antique dealer Dwayne Weber lay dying of kidney disease in a Pensacola hospital when he told his wife Jo that he was Dan Cooper. His wife had no idea what he meant. The couple was married for 17 years, after meeting in Atlanta 6 years after the hijacking. Weber rarely spoke of his past, but he had told his wife that he had served in the military and done time in prison for burglary. Just before he died, Weber also told Jo that he had sustained an old knee injury from jumping out of a plane. A book that Joe Weber checked out of the library in May 1996 said that D.B. Cooper was in his mid-40s, 6 feet tall, weighed 170 pounds, had black hair, was a bourbon drinker, and a chain smoker. At the time of the hijacking, Dwayne Weber was 47 years old, 6 feet, 1 inch tall, and weighed around 185 pounds. He had black hair, drank bourbon, and chain smoked. The similarities between a younger Weber and the FBI's composite drawings struck Joe, and the FBI began investigating a possible connection in March 1997. Weber served in the Army in the early 1940s and did time in at least 6 prisons from 1945 to 1968 for burglary and forgery. One prison was McNeil Island in Steilacoom, Washington, 20 miles from the Seattle-Tacoma airport. There were also a number of coincidences. Weber was sleep-talking in May 1978 when he said that he left his fingerprints on the aft stairs. Then he woke up in a sweat. During a trip the following year, the Webers stopped west of Interstate 5 across the Columbia River from Portland. Weber walked down to the river by himself. 4 months later, Brian Ingram found tattered money from the Cooper ransom in the area. Joe Weber was reviewing tax records in January 1994 when she came across an old plane ticket that said Seattle-Tacoma and Northwest Airlines. She was unable to find it again after her husband died. As he lay dying in hospital in March 1995, Weber said that he forgot where he buried $173,000 in a bucket. The FBI interviewed Joe Weber, one of Dwayne's former wives, and his brother. They compared his fingerprints with the 66 unaccounted-for prints on Flight 305. None matched, although the FBI had no way to know if any of the prints were Cooper's since other people had likely left behind fingerprints. In 2001, they lifted a DNA sample from the skinny tie that Cooper left behind on the plane. On March 28, 2003, 2 agents took an electric razor, a pair of slippers, gloves, and other items that once belonged to Weber. They compared Dwayne Weber's DNA to that left by the skyjacker on the tie and on cigarette butts. They didn't match. It seemed unlikely that Weber was D.B. Cooper. Over the years, the FBI has investigated about 1,000 suspects, tracked down leads across the country, and scoured the aircraft for evidence. Most suspects fitted the description. Most had what seemed to be unaccounted sources of income. There were questions about where many of them were at the time of the incident, and some had parachuting backgrounds, Himmelsbach said. However, none turned out to be the hijacker. In December 2007, the FBI released new composite sketches of D.B. Cooper and information on its website in hope of closing the case. Other material included photos of some of the recovered money, of a necktie that Cooper removed before jumping, a mother-of-pearl tie pin, one of the parachutes he left behind and the canvas bag in which it came, and a map of the search area where the FBI thinks he landed. The Cooper file fills up several shelves in the basement of the FBI's Seattle field office. It includes Dan Cooper's boarding pass from November 24, 1971, with the phrase Portland to Seattle flight handwritten in red ink and all capital letters, a few deteriorated bills, and a pink parachute that Cooper discarded after he cut its strings to secure the money to his waist. A padded envelope holds his black J.C. Penney clip-on tie. There are about 20,000 documents, mostly from dead-end leads. A sign above the files reads, "Do not destroy." Historical value. National Archives. Nearly 40 years after a man jumped out of a plane with a bag of money, the legend of D.B. Cooper persists. After his exploits made the news, people wrote songs and books, made a movie about him, and sold T-shirts of his likeness, all in honor of the first man to get away with hijacking a U.S. plane. Within less than a month after the incident, about 3,000 T-shirts inscribed with D.B. Cooper Where Are You were sold. In 1986, FBI agents Ralph P. Himmelsbach and Thomas K. Worcester published Norjack, the investigation of D.B. Cooper. They believe that Cooper died in the jump. 5 years later, Russell Callame, an FBI agent who worked the McCoy case, and Bernie Rhodes, a former parole officer, published D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy. They suggested that McCoy was Cooper because he had newspaper clippings about Cooper in his car, and his family claimed a mother-of-pearl tie clasp that Cooper left behind on the jet belonged to McCoy. Elwood Reed's novel D.B. presumed that the hijacker escaped to Mexico. In 1981, Roger Spottiswoode directed The Pursuit of D.B. Cooper, based on the book Free Fall by J.D. Reed and starring Robert Duvall, Treat Williams, and Katherine Harold. Every year around Thanksgiving, the Ariel Store and Tavern, a bar in southwestern Washington state, throws an 11-hour party to commemorate the anniversary of Cooper's mysterious jump. This village on the edge of Lake Merwin, about 10 miles east of Woodland, is thought to be where he landed. A corner of the bar features newspaper articles and wanted posters for Cooper. The festivities draw up to 300 people from across the United States, and they include raffles for Cooper memorabilia, a Cooper look-alike contest, and a competition to see who can tell the best story about what happened to Cooper. Despite the legendary status that Cooper's story enjoys, his hijacking led to significant improvements to air travel security. A latching device, called the Cooper vane, now prevents the rear stairway from being opened in mid-flight. Peepholes are also standard in cockpit doors. In 1972, the Federal Aviation Administration decided that the electronic screening of passengers and carry-on luggage would be mandatory, not voluntary, for all scheduled U.S. flights. Please subscribe my channel and like it.